In the burning silence of the New Mexico desert, a battle-worn U.S. veteran named Jim Walker was driving toward a life with no more purpose, until his dog Rex forced him to stop. Buried in the red sand stood a lonely 6-year-old boy, staring at them as if they were the last hope he had left in this world. Jim didn't know it yet, but saving that child would pull him into a storm far greater than the desert around them. A storm that would test his courage, awaken his faith, and give him the one thing war never could: a reason to live again. The late afternoon sun hung low over the vast New Mexico desert, staining the horizon in shades of rust red and burning gold. Heat shimmered above the asphalt as Jim Walker drove his dusty pickup along Highway 60, his window half open to let in the dry wind. At 50, Jim carried the quiet weight of a man who had survived too many battles. His sharp jaw, lightly grayed stubble, and storm-blue eyes spoke more of endurance than age. Beside him sat Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a muscular frame and a rich brown and black coat that glimmered in the sun. The dog's alert posture contrasted Jim's calm, revealing he was always ready before his owner ever needed him to be. Jim wasn't heading toward anything, only away from the noise of civilization. After years of service overseas and a divorce that had hollowed out whatever peace he'd tried to build afterward, he preferred the endless silence of the desert. Out here, even memory moved slowly. Rex, disciplined yet gentle, was the only companion he trusted completely. Jim tapped the steering wheel in rhythm to the faint static of an old radio, letting the monotony soothe him. But peace never lasted long for men like him. As the road curved around a formation of jagged red rocks, Rex suddenly straightened, ears pricking forward, his body leaning toward the windshield as if he sensed something invisible. Jim felt the shift instantly. Rex did not react to lizards, dust devils, or shadows, only to people. "What is it, buddy?" he muttered, slowing the truck. Rex gave a low, intentional whine, the kind he used during search-and-find drills. Jim scanned the landscape. Dunes, thorny shrubs, wind-carved ridges. Nothing unusual. But he trusted Rex more than he trusted most humans. He pulled to the shoulder, stepped out, and the heat hit him like a wall. The air tasted of sun-baked stone. Rex trotted ahead, nose low, tail alert. He didn't stray far, but his direction was clear, toward a cluster of rocks partially shading a small hollow beneath one of the sandstone formations. When Jim approached, he finally saw movement, a small figure sitting on the warm sand beneath the rock's shadow. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, with short dark hair tousled by the wind. His skin was lightly tanned from the sun, and his simple cotton shirt and khaki shorts suggested he'd been outdoors for hours, not days. The boy wasn't injured, just flushed from the heat, and visibly anxious in the unfamiliar terrain. He hugged his small backpack to his chest, as if it were a lifeline. Jim slowed his steps, raising both hands slightly to appear non-threatening. Rex stayed beside him, posture protective yet gentle, sensing the boy's nervousness. "Hey there," Jim said, voice steady but soft. "You lost, kiddo?" The boy blinked up at him with large brown eyes that held more confusion than fear. His lips parted, and a small, trembling voice escaped. "Help." It wasn't desperation, more like relief at finally seeing someone safe. Jim crouched to the boy's level, noting the faint dust on his clothes and the sweat on his forehead. He wasn't dehydrated, just overheated and scared. The boy clutched the straps of his backpack tighter. "Can't find my dad," he whispered. His accent was light, his voice clear. A child on a family trip, not someone abandoned. The desert simply swallowed distances faster than children could understand. Jim scanned the horizon instinctively. A misplaced child meant somewhere, Worried parents were searching. The desert, though beautiful, could disorient even experienced hikers, especially if a child wandered off a trail. "You did the right thing, staying in the shade," Jim reassured him. Rex stepped forward, tail slow and calm, lowering his head so the boy could touch him without fear. The child hesitated, then placed a tentative hand on Rex's fur. Jim watched Rex exhale softly, the dog's posture easing as he sensed the boy was no threat. "What's your name?" Jim asked. The boy swallowed. I'm Lucas." The name fit him. Gentle, straightforward, like sunlight through thin clouds. Jim didn't want to frighten Lucas with too many questions. Instead, he kept his voice calm. "All right, Lucas, we'll get you back to your dad. But let's get you somewhere cooler first." Lucas nodded, relieved. When Jim offered his hand, the boy took it without hesitation. His grip was small but trusting. Rex walked on the opposite side, forming a protective triangle around the child. As they walked back toward the truck, Jim noticed faint footprints in the sand, leading from a distant hiking path. It wasn't far, but for someone Lucas's size, it was far enough to be overwhelming. Jim imagined the fear in a father's eyes right now, and felt something stir in his own chest. Purpose. Jim lifted Lucas gently into the truck's passenger seat, buckling him in. The boy sat quietly, staring at Rex with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Is he your dog?" Lucas asked softly. Jim nodded. "His name's Rex. He's trained to help people." The boy reached out his hand, and Rex pressed his nose into it, sealing a wordless bond. Jim grabbed a bottle of water from behind the seat and handed it to Lucas, watching carefully to ensure he only took small sips. The sun was lowering, but the air still radiated heat waves. Jim leaned against the truck for a moment, letting the reality settle in. Out of all the places he could have driven today, fate had steered him straight to this boy. As Jim started the engine, a faint thought pressed into his mind. He had wanted solitude, silence, distance from every responsibility, yet here he was, responsible for a child he'd known for 5 minutes. Lucas sat upright now, the color slowly returning to his cheeks, his small fingers still brushing Rex's fur. "Thank you," the boy murmured. Jim nodded but didn't speak. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, heavy with the weight of stories buried beneath its sands, and somehow Jim felt that Lucas had become part of his. Rex rested his head on the console, watching the boy with protective focus. For the first time in months, Jim felt something shift inside him. Something like purpose waking up. With the sky turning violet and gold, Jim steered the truck back toward the nearest ranger station, determined to reunite Lucas with his family. Rex remained alert beside Lucas, steady as a guardian. As they drove, Lucas leaned against Rex, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Jim watched the road but kept glancing at the boy reflected in the mirror. That single word, help, echoed in his thoughts. He had come to the desert seeking distance from people, yet the desert had handed him someone who needed him more than he expected. The moment felt like a shift in destiny, a whisper of something greater guiding him. Whatever waited ahead, this was the beginning. The sun had dropped lower by the time Jim's truck rolled west toward the edge of Gallup, the desert's heat giving way to a cooler dusk wind. Lucas sat quietly against Rex, his small hands buried in the dog's thick brown and black fur. Jim kept glancing at the boy in the mirror, noticing how the child's earlier relief had faded into something tighter and quieter. Rex sensed it too. His ears twitched every few seconds, as if monitoring Lucas's breathing. The town lights appeared in the distance at last. Faded neon signs, a lonely motel, and an old-fashioned gas station with a green and white roof. Maria's Gas and Supply. Jim had stopped here before, years ago, when he still believed he could outrun memory. Tonight, he hoped the place still held something good. He parked beside the pump, dust swirling beneath the headlights. As Jim lifted Lucas gently from the seat, the boy clung to Rex instead, burying his face into the dog's neck. Jim didn't force him. He simply nodded and let Rex take the lead. The door to the station swung open, and a woman stepped out into the fading light. Maria Torres was in her mid-40s, tall but soft in posture, with warm bronze skin and long dark hair streaked with premature silver that she tied loosely behind her shoulders. Her deep brown eyes were the kind that carried both kindness and exhaustion, eyes that had watched life slip away more times than anyone should. She wore a simple denim shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing forearms marked faintly with old medical scars, reminders of her years as an army combat nurse. Maria paused at the sight of them, immediately scanning Lucas with the sharp precision of someone who had once triaged injuries under fire. "He's dehydrated," she said before Jim even reached her. Her voice was calm, steady, maternal, yet authoritative. "Not dangerously, but enough to scare him." Jim nodded, relieved at her presence. Lucas peeked out from Rex's fur, his face streaked with dust and dried tears. "It's okay, sweetheart," Maria whispered, kneeling so her height wouldn't intimidate him. "You're safe here." Something in her tone, gentle but grounded, made Lucas step slightly toward her, though he kept one hand gripping Rex's collar. Maria offered a small smile and guided them inside. The interior of the gas station was humble but warm. A soft lamp in the corner, wooden shelves lined with travel snacks, and a counter cluttered with maps of old hiking trails. A small radio hummed quietly. Maria led Lucas to a cushioned bench and brought a cup of cool water, encouraging slow sips. Rex sat beside the boy like a carved statue of loyalty. Jim stood nearby, arms folded, absorbing the scene. Maria glanced at him. "I haven't seen you in years," she said gently. "You still wandering?" Jim lifted a shoulder in a tired half-shrug. "Trying to." Something unreadable passed in Maria's expression. She had known men like him, warriors who carried storms behind their ribs. When she returned to Lucas, Maria softened her voice. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your full name, or where your dad was when you got separated?" Lucas looked up at her slowly, lower lip trembling. Then he shook his head, a shiver running through his small frame. Maria tried again with simpler questions, careful and patient the way she had once been with frightened soldiers. But each time she asked, Lucas's breathing hitched, and he pulled closer to Rex, clutching the dog like an anchor in a world suddenly too big. When Maria finally asked, "Do you remember anything at all?" the boy whispered a new answer, one that stilled the air. "No, I don't remember." His face crumpled as a quiet sob escaped him. Jim's chest tightened. He exchanged a look with Maria, who lowered her gaze thoughtfully. "Memory loss from heat stress is possible," she murmured, though her tone suggested she sensed more. She placed a hand lightly on Lucas's shoulder. Gentle, grounding. "It's all right to be scared," she whispered. "You're not alone." Rex rested his head in Lucas's lap, and the boy curled around him, trembling but comforted. Jim felt something shift again, responsibility expanding in his chest. He cleared his throat. "We should call the Rangers. Someone's missing him." Maria hesitated, then nodded, though her eyes lingered on Lucas with concern deeper than heat exhaustion. She stepped into the small side office to make the call. Through the thin door, her voice floated back, calm, efficient, describing the child and their location. Jim paced slowly, feeling the familiar restlessness of helplessness crawl under his skin. He had carried dying men before, but carrying a frightened child felt heavier. When Maria returned, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "A ranger patrol is 2 hours out," she said. "Storm clouds forming north. They told us to keep him here until they arrive." Jim rubbed the back of his neck. "He won't leave Rex," he said quietly. Maria smiled softly. "Then Rex stays too." As evening settled, Maria brewed chamomile tea for Jim and set warm tortillas on a plate, the simple comfort of a widow who had learned to care for strangers when loneliness echoed too loudly in her home. She sat across from him, hands wrapped around her mug. "You know," she began softly, "kids don't cling to just anyone. They cling to whoever their instincts tell them won't disappear." Jim looked away, jaw tightening. "I didn't choose to be found today," he muttered. Maria studied him with a quiet empathy, born of loss. "People rarely choose their purpose," she said. "It chooses them. And this boy, he didn't run to a ranger or a tourist. He ran to you." Jim didn't respond immediately. He watched Lucas from across the room, small body curled beside Rex, fingers still tangled in the dog's fur. The rhythmic rise and fall of Rex's breathing seemed to soothe the child more than words ever could. "I don't know what he's afraid of," Jim admitted quietly. Maria's expression softened. "Fear doesn't always have a face," she said. "Sometimes it's just a feeling, a shadow your mind can't name yet." She hesitated before adding more quietly, "But whatever frightened him, it was big enough to make him forget everything but the instinct to survive." Wind rattled the windows as night deepened. Maria dimmed the lights, her movements gentle, practiced. She pulled a soft wool blanket from a cabinet and draped it over Lucas. The boy stirred but did not wake. Rex adjusted to stay pressed close to him, warm and steady. Jim stood beside Maria, both watching the boy breathe. "You know," Maria said quietly, "children don't end up with certain people by accident." Her voice carried the weight of someone who believed in fate, shaped by years of losing and saving lives. She turned to meet Jim's eyes. "Lucas didn't come into my station by coincidence," she said, "and he didn't find you by chance." For the first time that night, Jim felt the words land somewhere deep within him. He looked at Lucas, small, lost, yet inexplicably safe beside Rex, and then back at Maria. The room felt quieter, as if the desert itself held its breath. Something about Lucas's arrival, the timing, the instinctive way he had clung to Rex. It all felt connected in a way Jim could not explain. Maria placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Whatever brought him to you," she murmured, "isn't done yet." Jim didn't argue. The truth was, when Lucas first whispered, "Help," something had awakened inside him, something he thought had died when he left the military, a sense of direction, a sense of purpose. As the desert wind howled softly outside Maria's station, Jim exhaled slowly, accepting that this child's story had now become part of his own. The road into Red Cliffs narrowed into a winding dirt trail carved between towering sandstone walls, glowing faintly under the rising moon. Jim's old truck rumbled steadily, its headlights slicing through drifting dust. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, his small frame wrapped in a blanket Maria had insisted he take. The boy's eyelids drooped with exhaustion, yet he clung tightly to Rex's collar, as if letting go might plunge him back into the fear he couldn't name. Rex, ever patient, sat pressed against him, his brown-black coat shimmering subtly in the dim cabin light. Jim kept his eyes on the road, aware of the silence that had settled over them like a heavy desert nightfall. Red Cliffs had always been his refuge, an inherited corner of solitude. Tonight it felt like the only safe place left. The cabin appeared at last, a simple wooden structure tucked against a sandstone slope, its weathered boards glowing faintly silver beneath the moon. Jim had rebuilt it over the years, adding a reinforced door, secure windows, and a stone fire pit. It was the one place where the past stayed quiet. As he parked, Lucas stirred, blinking in confusion. "This is home," Jim said gently. "Just for tonight." Lucas nodded weakly. Jim carried the boy inside, noting again how light he was, too light for a child his age. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Simple wooden furniture and an old lantern gave the space a warm, rustic glow. Lucas scanned the room with a wary expression, as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. Rex stayed close, lowering his head to reassure him. After settling Lucas on the old braided rug near the small stone fireplace, Jim lit the wood he'd stacked earlier that week. Flames sprang to life, casting long amber shadows. Lucas's breathing slowed as the warmth reached him. Jim prepared a simple meal: beans, tortillas, and warm broth, something mild enough for a child who had been shaken and dehydrated. Lucas refused to eat it first, shaking his head repeatedly. But Rex nudged the bowl toward him with a gentle paw, and the boy finally took a sip. "Good boy," Jim murmured to Rex, rubbing the dog's muscular shoulder. The moment held a quiet tenderness Jim hadn't felt in years, yet tension still lingered behind Lucas's eyes, a strain he couldn't hide despite his exhaustion. After dinner, Jim showed Lucas the small bedroom where he could sleep. It had once belonged to Jim's younger brother. Long gone, but the memories remained. The faded quilt and wooden toy horse on the shelf gave the space a soft innocence that seemed to calm Lucas. "You're safe here," Jim whispered, brushing the boy's hair from his forehead. Lucas nodded but did not let go of Rex's fur until the dog lay down beside the bed. Jim felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his chest. He wasn't sure how he had become the guardian of a child he'd met only hours ago, but something in the desert had chosen him. He left the door open and stepped into the main room to keep watch. Night deepened outside, the canyon winds whispering through the cracks of the old cabin. Jim sat at the small table, sharpening a utility knife he kept beside the lantern, more out of habit than fear. Memories of Maria's words echoed in his mind. Children don't cling to just anyone. He wondered what Lucas had seen before he wandered into the desert. Something had chased the boy. Not physically, perhaps, but deep enough in his mind to carve shadows. Jim poured himself a cup of coffee, though he barely tasted it. Rex remained in the bedroom doorway, half lying down but not truly resting, ears flicking with every distant sound. The dog sensed the tension as strongly as Jim did. Hours passed before the first sign something was wrong. A faint whimper drifted from the bedroom, not playful or sleepy, but sharp, panicked. Jim stood instantly. Lucas twisted beneath the quilt, his small hands clenched tightly. Sweat gathered along his temples despite the cool room. His breath hitched, and he curled as though bracing for a blow no one else could see. Jim knelt beside him. "Lucas," he whispered. "Hey, you're safe. Wake up, kiddo." But Lucas was trapped deep within the nightmare, too far to hear him. Rex stood rigid, tail stiff, hackles lifting in a silent alarm Jim recognized all too well from years in hostile territory. Then Lucas spoke, or rather gasped, a fractured murmur leaking from the fear inside him. "Bad men, coming." The words were whispered with such terror that Jim felt the temperature of the room shift. Lucas trembled violently, curling tighter, tears streaming down his cheeks. Jim placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, there's no one here," he said softly. "You're safe, I promise." But the child shook his head, still trapped in whatever memory haunted him. Rex stepped closer, pressing his nose to Lucas's side with a soft, whining sound, an attempt to pull him back to reality. The boy's breathing slowed slightly under the dog's touch, though fear still clung to him like smoke. Jim lifted Lucas into his arms and held him against his chest, rocking gently the way he'd seen field medics calm injured children overseas. Lucas eventually opened his eyes, dazed and frightened. "They're coming," he whispered again, barely audible. "Bad men." His words cracked with genuine terror. Jim's heart tightened. "No one's coming," he reassured him. "You're safe with me." But as Lucas trembled against him, Jim could feel the weight of something unspoken, something darker than a simple nightmare. When Lucas drifted back into uneasy sleep, Jim laid him down carefully. Rex remained beside the bed, guarding him like a vow. Back in the main room, Jim stood still, letting the silence reveal what instinct already knew. Lucas's fear wasn't random. His words hadn't been the babbling of a frightened child. They carried memory, trauma, the kind Jim had seen in soldiers who had run from horrors they couldn't name. Rex emerged from the bedroom, posture low and tense, his sharp eyes fixed toward the front door as if sensing a threat beyond the cabin walls. Jim knelt, resting a steady hand on the dog's thick neck. "You smell something?" he whispered. Rex's low growl answered the question better than words. Jim went to the window, peering out across the moonlit canyon. Nothing moved. No headlights, no footsteps, just the haunting stillness of red cliffs at night. Yet the unease in his chest deepened. He trusted Rex with his life. The dog never reacted without reason. Whatever chased Lucas was real. Maybe not here yet, but close enough to cast a shadow across the boy's dreams. Jim felt something awaken inside him, the old instincts he had tried for years to bury. He checked the cabin's locks, then returned to Rex's side, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Whoever the bad men were, they had set something in motion. As the fire dimmed to quiet embers, Jim sat with his back against the wall, Rex at his side, both keeping vigil while Lucas slept fitfully in the next room. The desert outside whispered with unseen movement, as if carrying a warning to those who understood how to listen. Jim exhaled slowly, accepting what the night had revealed. Lucas had not wandered into his path by accident. Someone had driven him into the desert, someone dangerous, and now that danger might be coming for all of them. Jim placed a hand on Rex's shoulder. "We'll protect him," he murmured. And in the darkness, Rex gave a single decisive huff, as if sealing a pact. The morning sun painted the canyon walls in copper streaks as Jim loaded Lucas gently into the truck, wrapping the boy in a blanket while Rex hopped into the back seat with protective alertness. Lucas had barely spoken since waking, though he clung tightly to Rex, burying his face against the dog's warm fur whenever the world felt too large. The nightmare still lingered in his eyes, a shadow he couldn't outrun. Jim drove toward Gallup Medical Center, a small but modern facility on the outskirts of town. The decision wasn't easy. Taking the boy anywhere public felt risky, but Lucas needed answers. Jim's jaw tightened as the miles passed. Something deep inside him, part instinct, part dread, told him the truth would be darker than he imagined. The clinic's waiting room was quiet, illuminated by soft fluorescent lights and decorated with local Navajo artwork. A nurse led them to an examination room where Dr. Samuel Ellis soon entered. Ellis was in his early 50s, with a tall, sturdy build softened by years of caregiving. His hair, thick and silver at the temples, framed a face marked by deep lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of both laughter and long nights. A neatly trimmed beard added a dignified sharpness to his features. He moved with calm precision, the kind of man who had seen more than he ever said. "I'm Dr. Ellis," he greeted, voice warm but analytical. His kindness didn't dull the quiet authority in his tone. He had been an ER physician during 2 major wildfire seasons. Nothing startled him easily. Lucas sat beside Rex on the padded table, and the doctor immediately noticed how the boy leaned toward the dog as if Rex were a shield. Ellis crouched to meet the child's eyes. "Hey, buddy," he said gently. "I just want to make sure you're okay. You're safe here." Lucas didn't answer, but allowed the doctor to examine him as long as Rex stayed close. Jim watched from the corner, arms folded, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Ellis began a steady, methodical check. Heart rate, hydration level, reflex responses. Everything seemed normal until he gently lifted the boy's sleeve. Ellis paused, frowning. There were faint but noticeable impressions around Lucas's wrists. Light discolorations, subtle pressure marks, the kind formed when someone had struggled against something restraining them. Not cuts, not bruises, but unmistakably signs of restraint. Jim felt his stomach twist. Ellis continued carefully, lifting the boy's pant leg, where he found similar mild scuff patterns along the side of his calf, as though the child had been pulled across rough ground. Nothing graphic, nothing life-threatening, but the patterns were consistent with coercion. "Lucas," Ellis asked softly, "do you remember how these happened?" The boy shook his head quickly and buried his face in Rex's fur, shoulders trembling. Dr. Ellis stood slowly and turned to Jim, voice low, controlled. "These aren't from a fall. They're patterned," he explained. "They look like pressure marks from being held or restrained. And these abrasions on his leg, they're old enough to have started healing, but recent enough to be concerning." Jim's jaw clenched. "Meaning what?" The doctor exhaled. "Meaning someone didn't treat this child gently. And this combination." He hesitated, choosing words with care. "It matches signs we sometimes see in trafficking victims or children being transported against their will." The room fell silent. The word trafficking tore through Jim's chest like shrapnel. Rex lifted his head, ears sharp, as if sensing the spike in tension. Jim stepped closer to Lucas, kneeling so they were eye level. "Hey," he whispered, voice steadier than he felt. "No one is going to hurt you again. Not while I'm here." Lucas nodded but didn't lift his face. Rex nudged him gently. Dr. Ellis approached with a softer tone. "He's not in immediate physical danger, which is good. Whoever handled him didn't cause major harm. But the psychological signs, they're worse." Jim's stare sharpened. "Meaning?" Ellis folded his hands, a gesture he often used when delivering difficult truths. "Children who have been kept, moved, or hidden by dangerous individuals often shut down memory to survive. His amnesia, the nightmares, the fear of bad men, none of it surprises me." A quiet rage simmered beneath Jim's skin, the same kind he had felt in war zones when injustice struck the most vulnerable. Ellis continued, "Legally, I'm required to notify Child Protective Services." Jim's expression shifted instantly, shoulders tensing. "No." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Jim, you know the protocol." Jim shook his head firmly. "If the wrong person shows up asking for him, that kid disappears, and we'll never see him again." Rex growled softly, as if agreeing. Ellis studied Jim's face for a long moment. "You're afraid the system can't protect him?" "I'm certain of it." Jim replied, voice low. I've seen how people like this operate. Once they want something back, they don't stop. Ellis sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Then we do this quietly. I'll file a medical-only record non-flagged. No identifying notes. It buys time. Jim exhaled slowly, grateful but tense. The doctor approached Lucas again, this time offering a small wooden dinosaur toy kept for young patients. Lucas took it hesitantly, fingers trembling less now. He's formed a strong attachment to your dog, Ellis said thoughtfully. In trauma cases, that bond can be life-saving. Jim glanced at Rex, whose steady amber gaze remained fixed on Lucas, as if guarding him from the world. Rex chooses who needs him, Jim murmured. He chose that boy the moment we found him. After finishing the exam, Ellis washed his hands and leaned against the counter, brows drawn. Jim, whatever happened to this child, whatever he ran from, they won't simply give up. The marks suggest restraint, but the emotional collapse? That's fear taught over time. Jim felt the weight of his military years settle over him like armor. Then he stays with me, until I know who's after him and why. Ellis nodded reluctantly. Keep him somewhere isolated. No public records, no unnecessary stops. And Jim, trust your instincts. You were trained to recognize danger before it arrives. Jim gave a silent nod. The instincts were already awake. Rex stood and circled protectively around Lucas as the boy slid off the exam table. The dog's posture made one thing clear. No one would touch this child without going through him first. Jim paid for the visit in cash, avoiding paperwork, and thanked Ellis. Outside, the late afternoon sun had faded into a darker orange, as though the desert itself sensed the shift in their journey. As Jim lifted Lucas into the truck, the boy whispered something barely audible. "Don't let them find me." Jim steadied him gently. "I won't," he promised. "Not ever." Rex pressed close, warm and solid, a silent oath beside Jim's words. As they drove back toward Red Cliffs, a single truth settled hard into Jim's chest. Lucas had been running from real danger, organized, deliberate, merciless. And now, by taking him in, Jim had stepped into the crosshairs of men capable of doing unthinkable things. But he didn't waver. He had faced worse. And this time, the life at stake wasn't a soldier or a teammate. It was a child whose whispered plea was now his mission. Rex shifted beside Lucas, sensing the rising tension and meeting Jim's eyes through the mirror. They were no longer driving away from danger. They were heading straight toward the truth. The desert night settled over Red Cliffs with a strange heaviness, the kind that made the air hum before a storm. Jim stepped onto the porch to breathe in the cooling air, but instead of relief, he sensed something shifting. The wind carried grit, and the horizon throbbed with faint red dust. Inside the cabin, Lucas curled beside Rex on the rug, drawing slow circles on the dog's thick fur as if the motion grounded him. Jim watched them for a moment before preparing for the night. He had survived ambushes, sieges, and firefights in hostile terrain, but protecting a child in a quiet canyon somehow felt heavier. When he stepped back inside, Lucas looked up, as if feeling the tension through Rex. "Is something wrong?" the boy asked softly. Jim forced a small smile. "Not yet, but storms here move fast." Thunder rolled low across the canyon floor, rumbling like an approaching drumline. Jim grabbed the shutters, handcrafted planks reinforced with metal strips, and locked them into place across the windows. The temperature dropped sharply as the incoming storm sucked the warmth from the air. Lucas hovered behind him, hugging himself in the oversized hoodie Maria had given him. Jim knelt, brushing the boy's hair back. "Hey," he murmured, "storms out here sound scarier than they are." Lucas nodded but didn't look convinced. Rex positioned himself between them, tail stiff, ears angled sharply. Jim recognized the posture immediately. This wasn't weather anxiety. Rex wasn't responding to the storm. He was sensing something else beneath it. Within minutes, the wind slammed against the cabin like a living thing. Sand hissed against the wooden walls, and the air filled with a muffled roar. The storm swallowed the moonlight until only the faint glow of the lantern illuminated the room. Jim double-checked the door brace, feeling the vibrations rattle through the frame. "It's okay," he said aloud, mostly for Lucas. The boy settled beside Rex, but kept his eyes fixed on the door. Jim could see something flicker behind that gaze, an old fear resurfacing, carving itself into his expression. "It sounds like they're knocking," Lucas whispered. Jim stiffened. "It's just the wind," he assured, though even as he spoke the words, his instincts sharpened like drawn knives. Rex suddenly shot to his feet, barking once, short, sharp, urgent. Not the bark of annoyance or fear, but a signal. Jim was beside the dog instantly. The storm howled, shaking the cabin, but beneath the chaos Jim heard something else. A faint mechanical hum. Headlights flickered through the cracks in the shuttered window for less than a second, swallowed quickly by the dust. Jim's heart kicked hard. No one would drive through a desert storm unless they had a reason, an urgent one. And no ordinary traveler would find this cabin, hidden deep within the cliffs. "Jim?" Lucas's voice trembled. Jim crouched in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me," he said quietly but firmly. "You're safe. Rex and I won't let anything happen to you." The boy swallowed hard and nodded. Outside, tires crunched over gravel. Slowly, deliberately. Jim moved silently to the corner of the room where he kept his emergency gear. A flashlight, a reinforced crowbar, and a compact, short-range radio. His fingers brushed an old knife, its handle worn smooth from years of service. But tonight, he hoped he wouldn't need it. Rex growled low, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. Jim whispered, "Where?" Rex stepped toward the back window, then the front door, as if triangulating movement. Jim trusted the dog over his own senses. Rex had saved his life twice before during their search and rescue missions. The dog's focus was razor-sharp now, pupils narrowed, muscles tensing like coiled steel. Jim hesitated for only a moment before closing the distance to Lucas. He scooped the boy into his arms, and Lucas immediately wrapped both arms around his neck, trembling. "It's them," Lucas whispered, voice cracking. "The bad men." The words pierced through Jim. Rex paced beside them, glancing between Jim and the door, as if awaiting orders. A harsh, metallic clang echoed outside. Maybe a car door slamming, maybe something striking the side of the cliffs. The storm masked most sounds, making each noise indistinct but threatening. Jim took a slow breath. He had built this cabin to withstand harsh weather and time, but never expected it to become a fortress. Lightning flashed briefly through the storm, illuminating vague silhouettes moving near the tree line, too distant to identify, too close to ignore. "Damn it," Jim muttered under his breath. He placed Lucas behind the stone fireplace, the safest area in the cabin. Rex immediately stationed himself in front of the boy like a trained barrier. Jim positioned himself between them and the door. Another flash, a quick strobe of pale light from outside, revealed the faint outline of a vehicle half buried in swirling dust, its shape angular, unfamiliar. Whoever they weren't lost. They had come for something. Or someone. The wind suddenly shifted, slamming sand against the cabin like a fist. One of the shutters rattled violently. Jim braced it with his forearm. He could feel the pressure of the storm, but underneath it, a vibration, a thudding in the earth. Footsteps? A vehicle engine? No, multiple engines. How many? Jim whispered to himself. Rex growled again, deeper this time. Jim crouched beside him. "Stay with Lucas," he ordered quietly. Rex obeyed instantly, planting himself like a shield. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, tears forming. "They found me," Lucas whispered, a tremor in his voice. "They're coming." Jim touched the boy's cheek gently. "Not while I'm breathing," he said. "You hear me? Not tonight." The cabin shook as a violent gust slammed through the canyon, knocking loose pebbles from the roof. Jim switched off the lantern, plunging the interior into near darkness. Only faint cracks of lightning illuminated their silhouettes. Outside, the storm's fury masked everything but brief flashes of movement. Jim's senses sharpened. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle shift in pressure. He had relied on these instincts through years of combat, reading danger through silence, finding threats in darkness. And now, those same instincts screamed that the storm wasn't the real threat. The real danger was using the storm as cover. A sudden metallic scrape sounded near the back window, faint but deliberate. Someone was circling the cabin. Jim clenched his jaw, muscles tense, heart steady. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. They had found the boy, despite no records, no alerts, no public exposure. That meant one thing. Someone was tracking them with precision. Jim pressed a hand to Lucas's head, lowering his voice to a whisper that vibrated with a vow he rarely spoke aloud. "I don't know who they are," he said, "or how they found you, but I promise you this. The desert can take me before I let them take you." Rex pressed closer to the boy, tail stiff, gaze locked toward the sound. The storm roared, lightning flashing again, revealing for the briefest moment a dark figure moving against the dust-laced night. Jim stepped forward silently, ready to face the unknown. The world outside howled like a beast, but inside the cabin there was only a soldier, a terrified child, and a loyal guardian, bound together by fate and danger. As another crash sounded in the darkness, Jim whispered one final vow to Lucas, his voice steady and unbreakable. "As long as I stand, no one will touch you." The storm outside had not weakened. It roared like a living creature hurling sand against the cabin walls. Jim's grip on the crowbar tightened as he moved silently across the dim room, every instinct sharpened by the threat he felt closing in. Rex stood rigid beside the stone fireplace where Lucas hid, the dog's fur bristling along his spine. Lightning cracked through the storm, briefly illuminating the silhouettes of 3 men entering the yard, dark figures moving with practiced stealth. They wore desert-colored tactical jackets, their faces covered by sand masks and goggles to withstand the storm. Whoever they weren't amateurs. They moved with the cold confidence of men who hunted for a living. Jim's pulse slowed, falling into the familiar rhythm of combat. The first intruder approached the front door, crouching as he examined the hinges. He was tall, lean, and efficient in his movements, with long arms suggesting someone used to climbing or working in confined spaces. The second man stood wider in the shoulders, carrying himself like he had military or security background. His calm stance hinted at discipline rather than haste. The third man, smaller and wirier, scanned the area restlessly, giving off a twitchy, volatile energy. They didn't speak. They communicated with signals. Jim watched their gestures through a thin gap in the shutter. These men weren't just chasing a runaway child. They were tracking a target. Jim placed a finger over his lips, signaling Lucas to stay silent. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he pressed himself closer to Rex, trusting the dog completely. Rex's breathing was steady, controlled, but the tension in his muscles signaled readiness for a fight. Jim moved closer to the fortified door and waited for the inevitable breach. The wind roared, and a sudden bang shattered the quiet, a heavy boot striking the wood. The door held the first time, but the force behind the next impact rattled the entire frame. Jim exhaled once, slow and steady. He had fought in worse conditions, but never with a child's life depending on his every move. The door cracked open with the third kick. The tall intruder entered first, sweeping the room with a flashlight beam. Before he could react, Jim lunged from the shadows, striking the man's wrist with the crowbar. The flashlight flew from his grip, clattering to the floor. Jim pivoted and delivered a second blow to the intruder's shoulder, dropping him to one knee. The man grunted in surprise, the kind of sound made by someone who expected easy prey. Jim didn't allow him a second chance. With a controlled strike, he slammed the crowbar into the intruder's thigh, knocking him fully to the ground. The storm muffled the sound of the struggle, but the second masked man had already entered. The broad-shouldered intruder advanced without hesitation, swinging a heavy metal tool in a calculated arc. He was strong, stronger than the first, and his movements showed training. Jim blocked the strike with the crowbar, the impact vibrating through his bones. The man shoved him backward, aiming to pin him against the wall, but Jim twisted aside, using the tight quarters of the cabin to his advantage. Years of military close-quarters combat kicked in like muscle memory. Jim slammed his elbow into the man's ribs, then drove his shoulder into the intruder's chest, sending him stumbling. The attacker recovered quickly, raising his weapon for another swing. A sudden snarl tore through the room. Rex launched himself like a missile. The dog struck the second intruder at the hip, knocking him sideways. His size, large for a German shepherd at 4 years old, and his training made the impact devastating. The man fell hard, his weapon clattering across the floor. Rex planted himself between Lucas and the attackers, teeth bared in a deep, warning growl that cut through the storm's roar. The broad intruder scrambled backward, clearly not expecting a trained dog to be guarding the child. Jim took the opening, delivering a hard punch that sent the man collapsing onto the wooden boards. Before Jim could catch his breath, the third intruder, the wiry, jittery one, darted into the room through the partially broken door. His movements were quick and unpredictable, fueled by panic or desperation. He scanned the room, saw the downed men, then spotted Lucas hiding behind the fireplace. His eyes widened behind the dust-covered goggles. "There!" he shouted, voice muffled but trembling with eagerness. Rex immediately stepped in front of Lucas, body low, hackles raised, prepared to launch again. The intruder froze, taking in the sight of the massive German shepherd ready to tear into him. The storm howled, lightning flashing just long enough to illuminate the terror on his face. Rex barked, a sharp, thunderous command that shook the intruder's nerve. The man stumbled backward, tripping over the doorstep as he tried to escape. Jim advanced slowly, shoulders squared, silhouette filling the doorway. "You picked the wrong canyon," he said, voice low and controlled. The intruder panicked, sprinting into the storm-blurred darkness. Within seconds, he vanished into the sheets of sand. Jim didn't chase him. The storm would punish him far more severely than Jim ever could. The first attacker groaned and tried to push himself upright. Jim kicked the weapon out of reach and pinned the man's arm with his boot. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The intruder coughed, but before he could answer, another violent gust slammed into the cabin, scattering debris and forcing Jim to shield his face. When he looked again, the man had rolled out of view, crawling into the storm's chaos until he, too, vanished. The second attacker was still unconscious, but Jim knew he couldn't secure him. Not in the storm. Not with Lucas trembling in the corner. Jim slammed the door shut and braced it again, heart pounding. He turned toward Lucas, who clung tightly to Rex, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Jim knelt beside him. "It's over," he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Lucas buried his face into Jim's chest, crying silent, exhausted tears. Rex curled around the boy, his warmth steady and grounding. Jim stroked the dog's back. "Good boy," he murmured. "Good, brave boy." As the storm roared outside, Jim carried Lucas to the safer corner of the cabin and sat down with him in his arms. Rex pressed close, resting his head on the boy's lap. Jim closed his eyes briefly, allowing the adrenaline to ebb. They had survived. Barely. The reality settled in hard and heavy. Whoever wanted Lucas was organized, armed, and relentless. But Jim also understood something else. He and Rex were the only barrier between the boy and the men who hunted him. And Jim intended to hold that line until his last breath, if he had to. Morning light crept slowly into Red Cliffs, turning the canyon walls gold as the storm finally passed. Jim stepped outside, exhausted but alert, carrying the weight of the long night on his shoulders. The yard still bore signs of the struggle, scattered footprints, a dent in the porch railing, and fragments of debris carried by the storm. Rex trotted beside him, tired but vigilant. Inside the cabin, Lucas slept curled beneath a blanket, clinging to the wooden dinosaur toy Dr. Ellis had given him. Jim kept the boy in his peripheral vision, afraid that if he blinked too long, he might vanish like the shadows of the storm. When the rumble of approaching engines echoed through the canyon, Jim tensed, ready for another fight, until he recognized the distinct sound of police vehicles. 2 SUVs and 1 marked patrol truck emerged around the bend, their tires crunching over gravel. Sheriff Daniels stepped out first. At 60 years old, Daniels was tall and rugged, with silver hair kept short and a neatly trimmed mustache. His weathered skin spoke of years under the desert sun, and his deep-set eyes held the weight of a man who had seen enough hardship to know when something serious was unfolding. Though age slowed his gait slightly, his posture remained firm. He was the kind of man people trusted instantly. Following him were 2 deputies, Officer Ruiz, a stout man in his 30s with a shaved head and a calm, measured demeanor, and Deputy Hawkins, a younger woman with light brown hair pulled into a tight braid and the sharp posture of someone still new but eager to prove herself. "Jim," Sheriff Daniels called as he approached the porch, his voice steady but concerned. "We got a call from Dr. Ellis. He said you were dealing with something urgent." Jim nodded. "That's one way to put it." Daniels scanned the damaged doorway, the splintered wood, and the disturbed sand. His jaw tightened. "Looks like a war zone." Jim exhaled. 3 intruders, organized. They were after the boy. Officer Ruiz crouched to examine the footprints leading away from the cabin. "Storm messed up most of the trail," he noted, "but whoever ran off probably didn't get far in that weather." Deputy Hawkins stepped beside Jim. "Is the child safe?" Her voice softened, revealing a gentleness beneath her composed exterior. "He's shaken," Jim answered, "but alive. Thanks to Rex." Inside, when Lucas awoke to the sight of uniformed officers, he froze, uncertain. Jim knelt beside him and stroked his hair gently. "They're here to help," he whispered. Lucas hesitated, then nodded cautiously. Sheriff Daniels entered the cabin slowly, removing his hat to appear less intimidating. "Hey there, kiddo," he said softly. "I'm here to make sure no one hurts you again." Lucas's small hand reached toward Rex, who pressed close, reassuring him. Daniels met Jim's gaze. We need to get statements, but first, we've already located the men who attacked you. Jim's brows lifted. Already? Daniels nodded. Storm trapped them in a washed-out ravine 3 miles east. They surrendered without a fight. Looks like they belong to a trafficking ring that's been operating across state lines. Lucas stiffened, tears forming in his eyes at the word trafficking. Jim held him close. Sheriff Daniels continued quietly. One of the men was carrying documents, routes, drop points. It's enough to put their entire operation under federal investigation. Officer Ruiz added, You saved that kid's life, Jim. If you hadn't intervened... His voice trailed off. Jim didn't need to hear the rest. He looked at Lucas, whose cheek rested against his shoulder, small body trembling. Rex placed his head gently on Lucas's lap, a steady, loyal weight. The boy reached toward Jim's collar, gripping it lightly. Home? He whispered, voice trembling with both hope and fear. The single word hit Jim harder than any blow from the night before. Lucas wasn't asking for a place. He was asking for belonging. Jim felt something inside him crack open, a tenderness he thought he had lost long ago in deserts on the other side of the world. Yeah, Jim whispered, tightening his hold on the boy. You're home. Sheriff Daniels watched the scene with quiet empathy. We'll handle the legal side, he said. No rush on statements. That boy has been through hell. Take the time he needs. Deputy Hawkins approached Lucas carefully and offered a gentle smile. You're very brave, she said softly. Lucas blinked shyly, then reached out one tiny hand to touch her badge before gripping Rex's fur again. Hours passed as the officers secured the property and transported the intruders. When the vehicles finally left, the canyon fell into a peaceful silence. The sun climbed higher, casting warm light across the cliffs. Maria Torres arrived shortly after, her old pickup rattling into the yard. She rushed out as soon as she saw Lucas and wrapped him in a tight embrace, tears brimming in her dark eyes. Mi cielo, she whispered, smoothing his hair. You made it. Lucas buried his face in her shoulder, relief washing over him. Maria placed a gentle hand on Jim's arm. God sent him to you, she said quietly. Some people get lost so they can be found by the right hearts. Jim wasn't a man of grand statements, but he knew truth when he heard it. He glanced at Rex, who sat proudly beside Lucas, and at Maria, whose compassion had guided them from the start. In the quiet of the desert, surrounded by people who had stepped into their lives at just the right moment, Jim felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Maria stepped back and studied Jim with a soft, knowing expression. You don't have to run anymore, she said. Not from your past, not from the chance to build something new. Jim swallowed hard. The words pierced deep, but they didn't hurt. They healed. As evening approached, Lucas tugged at Jim's sleeve and pointed toward the cabin. Us? He asked quietly. Jim lifted him into his arms, and Lucas rested his head against his chest. Rex trotted close, tail brushing against Jim's leg. Yeah, Jim said softly. Us. The Golden Canyon glowed with the warmth of a new beginning. No papers had been signed, no official words spoken, yet something sacred had formed between them. A fragile but undeniable family born not of blood, but of courage, kindness, and survival. The desert had brought them together, and now it felt as though it was blessing them with the chance to stay. As night settled and stars filled the sky, Jim sat outside with Lucas on his lap and Rex lying protectively at their feet. The silence was peaceful this time, not heavy with fear. Lucas traced shapes on Jim's sleeve, eyelids drooping. Jim, Rex, family? He whispered. Jim felt tears prick his eyes. He tightened his arms around the boy and nodded. "Family," he affirmed. Maria stepped onto the porch, watching the three of them with a quiet smile. "This," she murmured, "is a miracle born in the desert." And for the first time in a long time, Jim believed her. In a world filled with loss and shadows, sometimes God sends miracles in the quietest, most unexpected ways, like a lost child finding the right protector, or a battle-worn veteran discovering new purpose through love he never saw coming. This story reminds us that God always has a plan, and He places the right people in the right moment to heal what we thought was forever broken. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to help spread hope to others. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide every step of your journey with His light.